On April 29th, Adolf Hitler married his longtime mistress Eva Braun in a hastily prepared wedding ceremony. In accordance with German law, they both swore they were from complete Aryan descent. After a short reception, Hitler retired to his room, where he dictated his last will and testament. He took no responsibility for the war and urged the German people to carry on the fight against Jews. Then he added, "My wife and I choose to die in order to escape the shame of capitulation."
As the Fuhrer bunker, Berlin, the Third Reich was collapsing around him, Hitler sent out 3 messengers carrying his last will and testament, trying to get to Admiral Dönitz, who was in northern Germany, who was commander-in-chief of the German Navy. Hitler named Dönitz as his successor to be Fuhrer of the Reich.
After writing his will, Hitler was told his fascist friend Benito Mussolini had been shot and hung upside down in the Italian town of Milan. Hitler then prepared for his own death. An aide furnished him with glass capsules filled with cyanide, and Hitler fed the first one to his German shepherd Blondie. According to his confidant Albert Speer, the dog meant more to him than most of his associates.
The irony is this man who always appeared in German newsreels with his dogs very carefully had his dogs poisoned to test how effective and how quick the poison would act.
Soon afterward, he took Eva Braun into his room, where she took her poison first. Hitler then put a revolver to his head, bit into a cyanide capsule, and squeezed the trigger.
Once he was dead, his chauffeur and others carry out his last orders, which were to carry him up into the courtyard, which was being shelled at the time by the Russians. Doused he and Eva Braun with gasoline, set them afire, buried them in a shallow grave.
To the background music of Bruckner's 7th Symphony, Hitler's death was announced by radio.
It is reported from the Fuhrer's headquarters that this afternoon, our Fuhrer, Adolf Hitler, fell in his command post in the Reich's chancellery, fighting with his last breath for Germany against Bolshevism.
2 days after Hitler's suicide, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and his wife summoned their 6 children together and poisoned them. Then they took their own dose of cyanide. That same day, Moisey Dubinsky's Katusha rocket battery was given Hitler's headquarters as a target.
I experienced a great joy when I was ordered to fire upon the Reich's chancellery. I counted 128 rockets we fired that day. I said, "This is for my father, who was killed by the Nazis."
On May 1st, the Red Army captured the last German stronghold, the Reichstag parliamentary building. The Russians were certain Hitler was inside.
I was in a unit of combat engineers that entered the Reichstag. Our task was to remove enemy landmines. When we got to Hitler's office, all we found was a great chandelier that had fallen to the ground.
The Russians continued searching, and in the garden area of the Reich Chancellery, they found a shallow grave and exhumed Hitler's body.
An autopsy team summoned Hitler's dental records and confirmed the Fuhrer was dead.
There was also a fascination with the bodies of the Goebbels family.
I saw Goebbels lying on a table. His body was badly burned, but he still had one shoe left on. We were joking among ourselves. This is the man who said the Russians would never enter Berlin.
When the red flag was finally hoisted over the Reichstag, the Battle of Berlin was over.
You could tell the day it was all over from the many uniforms that were lying on the streets. The women were throwing uniforms in the street to save their husbands from being recognized as soldiers.
The Third Reich was in complete submission as the Russians prepared for their grandest act of revenge. 3.5 million German soldiers were marched off to Russia. Half of them were never heard from again. Peace had finally come to Europe, but as the Russian Iron Curtain fell across Berlin, the seeds of another, colder war were sown. In the last days of the war, Hitler's once mighty regime lay in shambles. At one time, the German Führer and his armies controlled nearly the entire landmass of Europe. By the end of April 1945, he could barely hold his own capital city. The American and British armies closed in from the west. The Soviet Red Army attacked from the east. Together, the Allies had virtually destroyed the German war fighting machine. In his final days, Hitler signed an order and named the new president of the Reich. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz would be the second Führer and inherit command of what remained of the German forces. No one questioned Admiral Dönitz's loyalty and dedication to the Nazi cause. During the war, as commander of the U-boat fleet, he faithfully carried out Hitler's orders. But now, as the new Führer, he could not ignore the disastrous reports coming from the battlefronts. German soldiers were walking into prisoner of war camps by the tens of thousands. Dönitz had decided to end the war as quickly as possible, but he wanted to delay the general surrender of all forces in order to, as he put it, save the maximum number of Germans from Bolshevism and enslavement. The admiral wanted to buy more time for German civilians and soldiers who were trying to avoid capture by the Russians and struggling to reach the jurisdiction of American and British troops. But the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, refused any deals. The Allies had agreed among themselves that the German surrender must be unconditional. The Allies would not accept any conditions or consider any special options requested by Admiral Dönitz and the German commanders. The Germans would have to carry out, without exception, the orders of their Allied captors.
The Allies, Russian and Western Allies, were in total agreement about what they were going to do. There was no division between them over the terms of the surrender. Unconditional surrender, no separate terms, no deals, nothing. Just lay down your arms and that is it.
Dönitz was running out of time. The rapid advance of Allied armies had isolated large parts of the German force in Italy. On Sunday afternoon, April 29th, 2 German officers, looking rather incongruous in civilian clothing, sat down at the headquarters of the British Army near Naples and signed the first formal surrender of German forces. Their signatures handed over to the British nearly 1 million men. 3 days later, on May 2nd, the ranking German left alive in Berlin emerged from his bunker with a white flag and surrendered the capital and its garrison to the Soviet Red Army. From his headquarters in northern Germany, Admiral Dönitz realized he couldn't play for time any longer. He sent a representative, Admiral von Friedeberg, across the front lines into the British sector to meet with General Bernard Montgomery. Dönitz instructed von Friedeberg to surrender all of the German forces fighting in northern Germany, even those fighting the Russians to the east. But Montgomery rejected that offer. The British Field Marshal would accept only the surrender of enemy forces directly facing his front line. Montgomery told von Friedeberg to return to Dönitz and relay this message. The next evening, May 4th, von Friedeberg and his delegation returned to Montgomery's headquarters. They agreed to surrender only the German forces in Denmark, Holland, and northern Germany.